Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to another in our series of lectures presented by the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Study of Core Texts and Ideas. This is the Great Books program, undergraduate program at the University of Texas. Anyone who doesn't know about it and would like to learn more about it, there's brochures we'll leave right here, and you can pick one up. And we'd be happy, I and my co-director, the other Professor Pangle, would be happy to talk to anyone about it at any time. And there are also many students here who are already involved in it. So if you want to just chat with anyone, if you don't know about the program and want to know more about it, feel free to do that, and they'll tell you, I'm sure, about it. Today, it's a great pleasure to welcome as our speaker Dr. Adam Schulman, who is at present a visiting professor at MIT. He has taught for many years at the St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, which is the great books college in the United States. He served for 7 years on the staff of the President's Bioethics Commission and has done other notable public works at the intersection of science and political life. And his teaching and his scholarly work has been very much in the history of science and its relation to modern science and to the history of the great books and great thinkers in the more humane side of our tradition. So he's a scholar and a teacher who brings together the sciences and the humanities in the study of the great books. And that indeed is what he's going to favor us with today in this lecture on entropy. Schulman?
Thank you, Tom. So there is a handout, but not quite enough copies to go around. So if you don't have a copy of the handout, try sharing when it comes up with someone else in this row. I'll give you my copy. If I need it, I'll take it back. So my theme is entropy, how it was discovered, what it means, and what might be its wider and deeper implications. I think every educated human being ought to know something about entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the entropy of the universe or of any isolated part of it is always increasing. After all, aside from Darwin's idea of natural selection, the relentless increase of entropy is perhaps the discovery of modern science that has most profoundly colored our current view of human life and its status in nature as a whole. But if you are still not convinced that you need to drop everything and turn to the study of the works of Carnot, Kelvin, and Clausius, let me shamelessly cite a well-known, if middle-brow, authority in support. Here is C.P. Snow, the British physicist and novelist, in his 1959 lecture on the two cultures. Quote, "A good many times I have been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, are thought highly educated, and who have with considerable gusto been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice I have been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is about the equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare? Parenthetically, it seems to me that most people find the first law of thermodynamics, which says that energy is always conserved, to be a more or less clear and reasonable principle, with little of the mystery and obscurity surrounding entropy and the second law. That attitude may not be justified, and at the end of this talk I will suggest that the opposite might be true. So this is a talk about entropy, but in a way it is also about optimism and pessimism in modern thought, as I will show you shortly. The modern scientific notion of energy, or the capacity to do work, was first discovered and championed by Leibniz, the German mathematician and philosopher, at the end of the 17th century. He used the Latin expression vis viva, or living force, but since about 1850 we have called it energy, derived from the Greek energeia, a word coined by Aristotle to mean something like activity. Leibniz was the first to propose the conservation of energy as a fundamental law of nature. Around the same time, Leibniz also expressed his view of the ultimate fate of the universe. In 1697, in an essay on the radical origin of things, he wrote, quote, "We must recognize a certain perpetual and very free progress of the universe as a whole, so that it always proceeds toward greater culture. And though it may be objected that if this were so, the world should have become a paradise long ago, there is an answer near at hand. Although many substances have already reached great perfection, yet there always remain in the abyss of things parts that are still asleep, yet to be aroused and advanced into something greater and better, and, in a word, to a better culture. Thus progress never comes to an end." Such was the optimism that could accompany the discovery of energy conservation at the end of the 17th century. Now, what Leibniz discovered was more precisely the interconvertibility of kinetic energy, or vis viva, the kind of energy that moving bodies possess, and potential energy, the kind that is stored up when a spring is compressed or a weight is elevated above the surface of the earth. It took another 50 years before modern science recognized that heat is yet a third form of energy, interconvertible under certain circumstances with kinetic and potential energy. The leading figure in that discovery was the English brewer turned physicist James Joule, who, like Leibniz, was a confirmed optimist. Here he is commenting on the cosmic implications of the inclusion of heat in the conservation of energy. Quote, "Behold, then, the wonderful arrangements of creation. Despite the apparent destruction of living force in almost all natural phenomena, we find that no waste or loss of living force has actually occurred. Thus it is that order is maintained in the universe. Nothing is deranged, nothing ever lost, but the entire machinery, complicated as it is, works smoothly and harmoniously." That is Joule in 1847, perhaps the high watermark of thermodynamic optimism. On April 24, 1865, 10 days after the assassination of President Lincoln, a new word came into being. That word is entropy. It was the invention of another German scientist named Rudolf Clausius. He fashioned it from the ancient Greek word trope, meaning transformation. And as Clausius explained, he wanted to form a word that would be as similar as possible to the word energy, and he borrowed its root from the ancient Greek in the hope that the word would be adopted unchanged in all modern languages. That hope has been abundantly realized. Like energy, entropy is the subject of a fundamental law of nature. But while energy can neither be created nor destroyed, entropy can only increase. As Clausius put it, summing up the two laws, the energy of the universe is constant, the entropy strives toward a maximum. Energy and entropy are the two basic notions of thermodynamics, the science of heat and its transformation into work. Energy, as I have indicated, may be defined as the capacity to do work. Because of the conservation of energy, it is not possible to do work without expending energy. This rules out the possibility of a perpetual motion machine, that is, a machine that produces more energy than it consumes and thus can run indefinitely without further consumption of energy. Some would say that the intuition, or if you like, the axiom, that no such machine is possible is the logical ground for the first law of thermodynamics. Heat, as we have known since Joule, is also a form of energy, namely thermal energy. But thermal and mechanical energy differ in an important respect. It is always possible to transform mechanical energy into thermal energy, but it is not always possible to transform thermal energy into mechanical energy. For example, a spinning propeller immersed in water will heat the water up by friction. But the heat in the water cannot, in general, be transformed back into the motion of a propeller. In fact, most heat is not available to do mechanical work at all. The Atlantic Ocean, for example, is a vast reservoir of heat, but very little of that heat can be used to do work. The entropy of a system is, roughly speaking, an indication of how much heat is available to do mechanical work. If the entropy increases, that means there is less available heat. And if, as Clausius stated, the entropy can never decrease, it follows that any heat that has, by an increase of entropy, become unavailable for work is irrecoverable. Applied to the universe as a whole, the law of the increase of entropy has a rather disturbing consequence, which was first noticed in 1852 by the British physicist William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin. Kelvin was the first to spell out the cosmic implications of the emerging science of thermodynamics. Here, in part, is the ominous conclusion of Kelvin's paper. Quote, "There is at present in the material world a universal tendency to the dissipation of mechanical energy. Within a finite period of time past, the Earth must have been, and within a finite period of time to come, the Earth must again be unfit for the habitation of man as at present constituted." Thus we see within a few generations the sunny optimism of Leibniz and the age of reason giving way to the doom and gloom of the 19th century, when scientists could prophesy with confidence the ultimate heat death of the universe. It seems to me that this cosmic pessimism, which began to take root in the late 19th century, has since become the dominant mood of the West. I am not, of course, insisting that the discovery of entropy bears primary responsibility for this development, but it must have helped. Here, for example, is Charles Darwin in 1876 commenting on, quote, "the view now held by most physicists, namely, that the sun with all the planets will in time grow too cold for life, unless indeed some great body dashes into the sun and thus gives it fresh life." Darwin continues, quote, "Believing as I do that man in the distant future will be a far more perfect creature than he is now, it is an intolerable thought that he and all other sentient beings are doomed to complete annihilation after such long continued progress." Next, here is the British logician and gadfly Bertrand Russell writing in 1903. "That man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving. That his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. That no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual beyond the grave. That all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." And finally, closer to home, here is the American theoretical physicist Steven Weinberg in the closing paragraphs of his 1977 book, The First 3 Minutes. Quote, "It is almost irresistible for humans to believe that we have some special relation to the universe, that human life is not just a more or less farcical outcome of a chain of accidents reaching back to the first 3 minutes, but that we were somehow built in from the beginning. It is very hard to realize that our world is just a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. It is even harder to realize that this present universe has evolved from an unspeakably unfamiliar early condition and faces a future extinction of endless cold or intolerable heat. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless." Weinberg adds some words of comfort. Quote, "But if there is no solace in the fruits of our research, there is at least some consolation in the research itself. The effort to understand the universe is one of the very few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy." It is partly in this spirit that I offer the following account of the discovery of entropy. By the end of this hour, I hope to have exhibited the difference between merely knowing by hearsay that the entropy of the universe is always increasing, and understanding with some precision where that idea came from, what it really means, and what evidence it rests on. The remarkable story of its discovery spans the years 1824 to 1854, during which most of classical thermodynamics was created by three men, one French, one British, and one German. Our story begins in 1824, when a young French engineer named Sadie Carnot wrote a long essay entitled Reflections on the Motive Power of Fire. With this little book was born the science of thermodynamics, and that science reached maturity essentially within one generation, thanks largely to the work of Kelvin and Clausius. Thermodynamics is the theory of the relation between heat and work, but its origins lie in practical engineering. The early 19th century was the age of the steam engine. In a steam engine, combustible fuel is burned in a furnace, water is thereby boiled, and the pressure of the expanding steam is used to drive a piston. A steam engine is an example of a heat engine, which expends a certain quantity of heat to produce a certain quantity of usable work. Steam is known as the expansive agent or working substance in a steam engine, but other heat engines use other substances, such as air, alcohol, etc. Carnot's Reflections begins with a series of questions chiefly of interest to engineers. What is the most efficient means of deriving work from heat? Is there any limit to the motive power of fire, that is, of the ability of heat to do work? Could improvements to the steam engine raise without limit the ratio of work produced to fuel expended? Would a heat engine be more efficient, for example, if it worked with an expansive agent other than water vapor, such as air? Or is there an assignable limit to the motive power of fire, a limit which the nature of things will not allow to be passed by any means whatever? On these seemingly modest practical foundations, Carnot built the theoretical edifice of classical thermodynamics. Now, at first glance, it might seem that a hot body, all by itself, can always be used to do work. One simply puts the hot body in contact with an expandable vessel filled with a gas, such as air or steam, and one uses the pressure of the expanding gas to drive a piston. Voila, work has been done. But Carnot was the first to see clearly that to derive work from heat, one must have not only a hot body, but also a cold body. To understand his insight, it will be helpful first to say something about the context in which Carnot was thinking and writing about heat engines. At the end of the 18th century, the chief rival to steam power was water power. Consider how a water engine, that is to say, a water wheel, derives work from the water flowing down a stream. A water wheel generates motive power by taking in water at a given height and releasing it at a lower height. Work can be derived from water engines only where there is water elevated above the adjacent terrain. As we would say, the potential energy of the elevated water is converted into the mechanical energy of the water wheel. Or as Carnot and his contemporaries would put it, the fall of water is the source of the motive power of the water engine. If all the water on Earth were at sea level, there would be in effect a kind of equilibrium, and no work could be done by water engines. Only where there is a lack of equilibrium in the elevation of water, that is, wherever water is raised above some of its surroundings, can work be done when the water falls. In reflecting on the steam engine, Carnot noticed what seemed to him an analogous fall of heat. What happens in a steam engine is this. Heat is generated at the furnace at a high temperature. It is then incorporated into the steam, which expands and drives the piston. Then the steam is brought in contact with a cold body, or refrigerator, which condenses the steam by cooling it, after which it is again put in contact with the furnace, and the cycle begins all over again. Carnot saw that in every case, work can be produced from heat only if some heat is absorbed from the furnace at a higher temperature and discharged at the refrigerator at a lower temperature. He concluded that just as the fall of water from one height to another is the source of motive power in the water wheel, so too the fall of heat from one temperature to another is the source of power in a steam engine, and hence presumably in any heat engine. Now, it may have occurred to some of you that one could operate a steam engine without any refrigerator at all. That is, after boiling the water and using the pressure of the expanding steam to drive the piston, you simply open the piston, expel the steam into the atmosphere, add new water, and begin the boiling process all over again. In fact, the more primitive steam engines of Carnot's time did operate in just this way, using fresh water for each cycle and eliminating the condensation phase. In that case, what becomes of Carnot's fall of heat? Carnot, however, anticipated this objection and answered it by pointing out that in such instances, the atmosphere itself is cooler than the steam and functions as an enormous refrigerator. That is, when the piston is opened, the heated steam goes away only because the surrounding air is cool enough to receive it. Thus, the condensation phase cannot really be eliminated. In harnessing the motive power of heat, one cannot escape the necessary flow of heat from a hot body to a cold body. As Carnot put it, the motive power of a steam engine is due to a reestablishment of the equilibrium of caloric, his name for heat. That is, just as water spontaneously flows downhill to restore its mechanical equilibrium, so heat spontaneously flows from a hotter body to a colder body to restore its thermal equilibrium. And just as water engines could do no work if all water were at sea level, no work could be done by steam engines if all bodies were at the same temperature. And just as water never spontaneously flows uphill, heat never spontaneously flows from a colder body to a hotter body. Conversely, wherever there exists a difference of temperature, motive power can be produced by allowing the heat to fall from the hot body to the cold body while driving a heat engine. Carnot took the analogy with water's power one step further, however. Just as the water driving a water wheel is not destroyed in passing from one elevation to another, Carnot reasoned that heat is not consumed in passing through a heat engine. It is merely transported from a hot body to a cold body. Carnot found it easier to draw this conclusion because he believed in the conservation of heat. That is, he subscribed to the common view championed by Lavoisier in the previous century that heat is a subtle material fluid, usually called caloric, that can be neither created nor destroyed. The very title of Carnot's book, On the Motive Power of Fire, already indicates his belief in the material nature of heat. The fall of heat that produces motive power in a steam engine is thus the flow of caloric from a hot body to a cold body. And since heat or caloric is indestructible, the steam engine does not operate by converting heat into work. In the cyclical operation of the steam engine, the same quantity of heat that is absorbed by the steam at the furnace must also be discharged by the steam at the refrigerator. By the 1850s, it was to become clear that the caloric theory was untenable as an account of the nature of heat, and it began to give way to the rival mechanical theory of heat. According to the mechanical theory, heat is not a subtle material substance, it is a form of motion. Heat is not conserved during the operation of a steam engine, it is consumed in the production of work. Indeed, the quantity of work produced by the consumption of a unit of heat is always the same, a universal constant of nature. Thus, the steam engine produces a certain quantity of work only because a definite quantity of heat is consumed during each cycle. Accordingly, on any cycle in which work is done, the quantity of heat discharged at the refrigerator must be smaller than the quantity of heat absorbed at the furnace. I think I'm showing myself to be a heat engine right here under these hot lights. That is, if the heat absorbed at the furnace, of the heat absorbed at the furnace, part is converted into work and part is passed to the refrigerator. Note that the old caloric theory and the new mechanical theory of heat are not in disagreement about the conservation of energy. Carnot himself accepted the principle that energy, the capacity to do work, can neither be created nor destroyed. What Carnot denied is that heat is a form of energy. Instead, he considered it an indestructible substance that is capable of doing work when it undergoes a fall in temperature, just as water is capable of doing work when it undergoes a fall of elevation. Overall, Carnot had 3 brilliant insights that survive to this day, unsullied by his error regarding the nature of heat. The first insight is the fall of heat, which we have already considered. The second insight is the cycle. Carnot saw that in order to understand the motive power of a steam engine, it is not enough to look only at the heat generated in the furnace and the work done by the piston. In order to see the relation between heat and work, one must contrive to return the heated and expanded steam to its original condition. That is, the steam must be cooled and compressed so that it is in exactly the same state it was in before it absorbed heat from the furnace. Only if the cycle is completed in this way can we be confident that the work done by the piston is the only mechanical effect of the heat absorbed at the furnace. If we do not complete the cycle but leave the steam in its heated and expanded state, we would have to include the alteration of the state of the steam as an effect of the heat absorbed at the furnace. In short, Carnot saw that a complete cycle must be considered if we are to understand fully the necessary and sufficient conditions for heat to do work. Now, consideration of the complete cycle and the fall of heat led Carnot to his third great insight. He noticed that under certain circumstances, the operations that make up the cycle are reversible. What do we mean by a reversible process? Consider again the water wheel. Under normal operation, the wheel produces work by taking in water at the upper level and discharging it at the lower level. But the wheel could be operated in reverse, taking in water at the lower level and discharging it at the upper level. In that case, of course, we would have to supply the work of turning the wheel and raising the water. In effect, a water wheel operating in reverse is a machine for converting mechanical energy into the potential energy of water at a raised elevation in the Earth's gravitational field. Note, however, that no actual water wheel can be entirely reversible. If at any point in the operation of a water wheel, any water is allowed to fall some distance without driving the wheel, that part of the operation is irreversible because turning the wheel in reverse would not restore the water to the height that was lost. In a perfect or completely reversible water wheel, the water must not be permitted to fall any distance without driving the wheel as it falls. Of course, water wheels fall short of perfect reversibility in other ways as well. Any friction in the operation of the machinery, any turbulence in the flow of the water are processes that it would be impossible to reverse if the wheel is operated backwards. Carnot noted that heat engines, too, can be operated in reverse. Under normal operation, a heat engine produces work by taking in heat at the furnace at a higher temperature and discharging heat at the refrigerator at a lower temperature. Operated in reverse, a heat engine would absorb heat at the lower temperature and discharge heat at the higher temperature. In effect, a heat engine operating in reverse is a refrigerating machine or a heat pump, which extracts heat from a cold body and expels it into a hotter body. Of course, to operate a refrigerating machine, we would have to supply work in order to drive the heat engine in reverse. In a reverse steam engine, for example, we would have to compress the steam mechanically at the higher temperature so as to expel its heat to the hotter body or furnace. Carnot saw that not every heat engine can be operated fully in reverse. In particular, if at any stage in the operation of a steam engine, some heat is allowed to fall from a higher temperature to a lower temperature without doing expansive work on the steam, that part of the operation will not be reversible. For example, if the vessel containing the heated steam is not well insulated and loses some of its heat by direct conduction to the cooler air that surrounds it, that part of the cycle will be irreversible because by operating the engine backwards, it would not be possible to recover the heat lost to the environment. A fully reversible steam engine is one in which no heat is ever allowed to flow directly from a hot body to a cold body, or equivalently, one in which the fall of heat is always mediated by the expansive work of the steam. Or as Carnot put it, the condition of perfect reversibility, and hence maximum efficiency in a heat engine, is that there should occur no changes of temperature which are not due to changes of volume. In practice, all actual working heat engines are irreversible to one degree or another. Nevertheless, Carnot's theory is founded on consideration of the ideal perfectly reversible heat engine. If during one cycle a reversible steam engine absorbs a certain quantity of heat from the furnace and produces a definite amount of expansive work, then by consuming that same amount of work, we can operate the engine in reverse and restore to the furnace the same quantity of heat. That is Carnot's idea of reversibility. Now, armed with these three great insights, namely the fall of heat, the cycle, and the idea of reversibility, Carnot stated and proved an astonishingly general theorem regarding the operation of any and all heat engines. This theorem permitted him to answer the questions with which his reflections began about the maximum efficiency possible in heat engines. As you will recall, engineers of the time wondered whether there was any assignable limit to the amount of work that could be extracted from a given quantity of heat, and whether in particular an expansive agent other than steam might derive work from heat more efficiently. What Carnot proved was, in his own words, that the motive power of heat is independent of the agents employed to realize it. Its quantity is fixed solely by the temperatures of the two bodies between which the transport of caloric finally takes place. And therefore, the maximum motive power resulting from the employment of steam is also the maximum motive power realizable by any means whatsoever. More precisely, what Carnot shows is that any reversible engine operating between two fixed temperatures produces work at the maximum efficiency possible for those temperatures. That is, no choice of a different working substance could possibly improve on the efficiency of a given reversible engine. His proof is a remarkably simple reductio ad absurdum, and I direct your attention to the back of the handout now for this. Suppose we have a working reversible heat engine that after a certain period of operation has absorbed a quantity of heat Q at the furnace while producing a quantity of work W. This is process A in the handout. Operated in reverse, our engine will consume a quantity of work W while discharging to the furnace the quantity of heat Q. That's process B. Now imagine that there is a second, more efficient engine that absorbs the same quantity of heat Q at the furnace while yielding a larger quantity of work, W plus delta W, greater than the work produced by our first engine, and call the operation of this second engine process C. Suppose we now combine the forward operation of our second engine with the backwards operation of our first engine, process B plus C. Our second engine absorbs heat Q at the furnace while yielding work W plus delta W. That's process C. Our first engine operated in reverse will restore all the heat Q to the furnace while consuming only work W. That's process B. The net result of B plus C is that the quantity of work delta W has been produced without taking any heat from the furnace. Now at this point, Carnot took a false step, guided by his belief that heat is indestructible. Since all the heat absorbed at the furnace has been returned to it by the end of our combined operation, Carnot assumed that the refrigerator has also given back all the heat that it received. The net effect of the combined operation was, in his eyes, the creation of work out of nothing. And that is impossible because it amounts to the operation of a perpetual motion machine. But if we do not assume with Carnot that heat is indestructible, and instead acknowledge that some of the heat is converted into work, we will have to conclude that at the end of Carnot's combined operation, the work delta W has been produced not out of nothing, but out of heat extracted from the refrigerator. This would not be a perpetual motion machine in the original sense, but rather a machine that does work merely by extracting heat from the colder body. Had Carnot remained agnostic on the question of the nature of heat, he could still have proved his theorem by basing his reductio on a different ground. Let me explain, and again refer you to the handout. Consider again the three processes A, B, and C. Process B, you will recall, is the reverse operation of our engine 1, consuming work W while discharging heat Q to the furnace. Suppose that this engine is run a little bit longer, so that altogether it consumes work W plus delta W while discharging to the furnace a larger quantity of heat Q plus delta Q. Let us call this prolonged version of process B process D. If we now combine processes D and C, the net result is that no work has been done, while a quantity of heat, delta Q, has been transmitted to the furnace. Now, both the caloric and the mechanical theory of heat agree in denying that heat can be produced out of nothing when no work has been done. And therefore, on both theories, we are forced to conclude that the heat delta Q given to the furnace has in fact been extracted from the refrigerator, so that the net result is that heat has been transferred from a cold body to a hot body without any other permanent change taking place. But that is impossible according to Carnot, so our original assumption that engine 2 is more efficient than the reversible engine 1 must be false. QED. Notice, however, that Carnot's flawed reductio proof relied on the impossibility of producing work out of nothing. That is, on the principle of the conservation of energy, which has come to be known as the first law of thermodynamics. In contrast, our modified version of his proof relies on the statement that heat cannot flow spontaneously from a cold body to a hot body. And this latter statement is the form in which Clausius first expressed his entropy principle, which we now call the second law of thermodynamics. It is often said that Carnot, with his insight about the fall of heat and his belief that heat was indestructible, discovered the second law of thermodynamics without knowing the first law. But that is quite misleading. As we can see in his rejection of perpetual motion, Carnot embraced the idea of energy conservation. He merely denied that heat is a form of energy.